I signed the divorce papers without begging. Then the Alpha Mafia Boss lost control. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel and knowing who is joining us today. Now, let us begin today's story. The moment Julian Reed stopped begging for his marriage, Vincent Calloway finally became afraid of losing it. The divorce papers rested between them on a polished walnut table inside Vincent's attorney's office, 20 floors above downtown Chicago. Julian had imagined this moment for months. In those private rehearsals, his hands shook, his voice cracked, and some foolish part of him always asked Vincent whether 3 years together had meant anything. Reality was quieter. Julian read every page, checked every clause, and reached for the black fountain pen. Across the table, Vincent watched him with the unreadable expression that had made powerful men reconsider entire conversations. At 32, Vincent carried alpha authority without needing to announce it. His tailored charcoal suit, controlled voice, and reputation as head of the Calloway organization usually made a room adjust itself around him. Julian had once mistaken that certainty for safety. "Your attorney can review it again," Vincent said. Julian looked up. "She already did. You can take another day." "You asked for the divorce, Vincent." Something shifted behind Vincent's eyes. "I know what I asked for." Julian almost smiled at the strange answer. For weeks, Vincent had been distant and painfully formal, apparently convinced their marriage had become an obligation neither man should continue. Julian had spent too many nights trying to repair conversations Vincent refused to have. He was finished proving that love could survive on one person's effort. Then there is nothing left to discuss. Julian signed his name. The pen moved smoothly across the final page. No tears, no bargaining, no promise to change into someone easier to keep. Vincent's alpha presence suddenly sharpened, making the room feel smaller, but Julian experienced something unexpected. Instead of shrinking beneath it, he felt calm. A cool sensation moved through his wrist like water beneath moonlight. Vincent stood abruptly. "Julian." The attorney glanced up. Julian capped the pen. "What?" Vincent seemed unable to answer. His carefully controlled presence flickered again, not threatening, but unsettled, as though some instinct had expected Julian to reach for him and could not understand why he had not. Julian removed his wedding ring. For one dangerous second, memory tried to stop him. Vincent placing that ring on his finger 3 years earlier. Vincent bringing coffee to Julian during late nights. Vincent silently leaving his coat around Julian's shoulders during a freezing December walk. Good memories were not proof that a broken marriage should continue. Julian placed the ring beside the papers. "The apartment downtown is already leased. I will collect the rest of my belongings tomorrow." Vincent stared at the ring. "You arranged an apartment? 2 weeks ago. You never told me." Julian met his gaze. "You stopped asking where I planned to go." That landed harder than anger would have. Vincent slowly sat down. Julian stood, thanked the attorney, and walked toward the door. "Julian." He stopped but did not turn. Vincent's voice had lost its usual certainty. Was it really that easy? Julian closed his eyes briefly. "No, I just finished doing the difficult part before I entered this room." He stepped into the hallway. The elevator was less than 30 feet away, yet each step felt like crossing years. Behind him, Vincent did not follow. Julian was grateful. He was also strangely disappointed. The elevator doors opened. As Julian reached for the button, warmth suddenly spread across his wrist. He pulled back his sleeve. A pale mark he had carried since childhood was glowing silver. It resembled a broken crown, surrounded by a thin circle of light. Julian stared at it until the elevator doors closed. Inside the attorney's office, Vincent remained motionless before the signed documents. Then the attorney whispered his name. Vincent looked down. A silver symbol had appeared beneath Julian's signature, bright enough to reflect across the polished table. Vincent's face changed. He recognized that symbol. Years ago, his grandfather had shown him the same broken crown inside a forbidden Calloway family archive and given him one warning. If this mark ever returned, the man carrying it was not someone the Calloways were meant to control. He was someone they had sworn to protect. Julian spent his first night alone in a one-bedroom apartment overlooking a quieter stretch of Chicago, where the city lights reached his windows without carrying the weight of the Calloway name. He had chosen the place himself, paid the deposit from his own savings, and furnished it with nothing more impressive than a couch, a kitchen table, and several boxes he had not unpacked. It felt more like home than the mansion had in months. By morning, the silver mark on his wrist had faded again. Julian told himself stress could explain many strange things, although glowing birthmarks were probably not among them. At 9, he returned to the Calloway residence to collect his remaining belongings. Vincent was waiting in the library. "I thought you would send someone," Julian said. "I considered it." And Vincent looked at him for a long moment. "I realized I've spent too much of our marriage letting other people handle conversations I should have had myself." Julian did not reward the admission with forgiveness. "My boxes are upstairs. They are untouched." Julian started toward the stairs. Vincent did not block him. That mattered more than Julian wanted it to. 20 minutes later, Julian carried down the first box and found Vincent examining a folder on the library table. "What is that?" Julian asked. "A financial report." "I can see that." Vincent's mouth tightened. 3 years ago, you warned our investment office that the Lakeview development projections were inflated." Julian remembered. "Nobody listened." "You were right. That is an unusually late compliment." Vincent ignored the remark. "You also recommended restructuring 2 hospitality properties before interest rates changed." "You ignored that too." "I thought the recommendations came from Bennett." Julian stopped. Bennett had been Vincent's senior financial advisor. "He presented my analysis at the quarterly meetings because you never invited me." Vincent became very still. Julian continued. "I was your husband, Vincent, not decorative furniture. I studied economics. I worked in corporate forecasting before we married." "You knew that." "I knew. Knowing is not the same as respecting." Julian picked up his box. Vincent had no answer. For once, Julian did not remain long enough to make the silence easier for him. By afternoon, Julian was back downtown reviewing freelance consulting offers when an email arrived from his attorney. One attachment concerned routine identity verification required for the divorce filing. The second contained a problem. Julian's original birth certificate could not be located in state records. The document he had used since childhood was a later registration issued after he entered foster care. Julian called immediately. "Are you saying I do not have a birth record?" "I am saying the original is missing," his attorney replied. "There is another irregularity. Your childhood file references a private foundation that covered your care for several years, but the foundation no longer exists." "What was it called?" Papers shifted on the other end. "Stillheart Trust." The word sent warmth through Julian's wrist. He pulled back his sleeve. Silver light returned beneath his skin. This time he did not dismiss it. Across the city, Vincent stood inside a private Calloway archive his grandfather had forbidden him to open unless the broken crown ever appeared. He had spent the morning resisting the urge to call Julian because wanting someone back did not give him the right to interrupt the life that person had chosen. Instead, he searched for answers. The archive contained ledgers dating back more than 2 centuries, but one name appeared repeatedly beside the broken crown. Stillheart. Vincent opened the oldest volume and found a handwritten oath. The Calloways had once served as guardians to a vanished royal bloodline whose power could calm alpha dominance without controlling the alpha himself. The final sentence made Vincent's pulse change. The heir would return only after freely surrendering a bond that had become unequal. Vincent thought of Julian signing the papers without hesitation. His phone was already in his hand before he stopped himself. Calling Julian with half an explanation would only repeat the same mistake, deciding what Julian needed before asking. Vincent closed the archive and contacted an independent historian instead. Meanwhile, Julian searched his foster records and discovered one surviving address connected to Stillheart Trust. It belonged to a retired archivist named Margaret Ellis, who lived 40 miles outside Chicago. Julian sent her a careful email explaining who he was. Her response arrived 12 minutes later. It contained only 3 sentences. She had been waiting 26 years for someone named Julian Reed to contact her. She knew why his original birth certificate had disappeared, and before Julian visited, she told him to bring the silver pendant that had been found with him as an infant. Julian stared at the screen. He had never told her about any pendant. Julian drove 40 miles northwest the next morning with the silver pendant resting beneath his shirt and more questions than he knew how to organize. Margaret Ellis lived in a modest house near a wooded preserve, far from the polished towers and guarded estates that defined Vincent's world. She was 73, sharp-eyed, and entirely unimpressed by Julian's cautious introduction. "You have his eyes," she said before inviting him inside. Julian stopped. "Whose?" Margaret looked toward the pendant beneath his collar. "Your father's." That answer carried him into a study filled with archival boxes and carefully labeled photographs. Margaret explained that she had worked for Stillheart Trust when Julian was an infant. Officially, the foundation had supported displaced children. Privately, it protected records belonging to a bloodline, erased generations earlier. "Why was I hidden?" Julian asked. Margaret folded her hands. "Because your parents believed someone would use your identity to control you before you were old enough to understand it." Who were they? Scholars, protectors, and descendants of something people eventually reduced to a legend. She placed a sealed envelope on the table. The broken crown was pressed into its wax. Julian's wrist warmed instantly. "The Lost Prince," Margaret said. Julian almost laughed. "I am supposed to believe I am royalty?" "No, you are supposed to examine evidence." Julian liked her immediately. Margaret showed him photographs, guardianship records, genetic reports, and copies of letters written by his parents. The documents did not describe a throne waiting for him. They described an ancient hereditary role called the Lost Prince, preserved outside ordinary royal succession. Its purpose was to carry a sacred resonance known as Stillheart. "Why call it lost?" Julian asked. "Because the bloodline was deliberately removed from public history." "And the power?" Margaret hesitated. "It does not command. It quiets command." Julian thought of Vincent's alpha presence in the attorney's office and the strange calm that had spread through him. Margaret continued, "Most alpha resonance pushes outward. Stillheart does something considered impossible by modern theory. It creates a space where dominance loses its supernatural pressure, but free will remains untouched." Julian stared at her. "I'm not an alpha. Your records classify you as Omega." "Because I am one." "Perhaps." Margaret's expression remained careful. "Or perhaps modern classifications were never designed to recognize what you are." Julian disliked how much sense that possibility made. His entire life, doctors had described his resonance as unusually faint. He had never experienced the responses expected from someone with a conventional designation. Still, he refused to exchange one unquestioned label for another. "I want independent verification." Margaret smiled. "Your mother said you would." Meanwhile, Vincent sat acros. The public research library had never seemed particularly dramatic to Julian until an ancient silver pendant began glowing beneath fluorescent lights. He sat across from Vincent in a private study room the next morning while Margaret Ellis and Dr. Nathan Cole compared copies of the Stillheart records with documents from the Callaway archive. Vincent had arrived alone. No assistants, no security detail inside the room, and no attempt to take control of the meeting. Julian noticed. He also refused to mistake improvement for absolution. "These genealogies match," Nathan said after nearly an hour. "Different sources, different handwriting, different preservation histories, but the names and dates overlap." Margaret opened Julian's mother's letter. "And this explains why the bloodline disappeared." Nathan nodded. "The Lost Prince was never an ordinary royal heir. The title belonged to a hereditary guardian outside conventional succession." Julian folded his arms. "So no throne. Apparently not. Good. I already have enough paperwork. Vincent almost smiled. Nathan continued, explaining that Stillheart had been described as a sacred counterbalance to coercive alpha resonance. Modern designation systems had no category for it because the bloodline had vanished before those systems were standardized. Julian's childhood classification as Omega had therefore measured what his resonance resembled, not necessarily what it was. I want medical and historical verification before anyone changes a word in my records, Julian said. Agreed, Margaret replied. Vincent remained silent until Julian looked at him. You have nothing to say? I have several things to say. That has never stopped you before. Vincent accepted the criticism. This is your identity. I did not get a vote. Julian had expected resistance. The absence of it unsettled him in a different way. Nathan placed a small resonance instrument on the table. There is one test we can perform without assigning you a new designation. It only measures environmental pressure. Julian agreed. Nathan activated the instrument, producing a low alpha frequency field designed for calibration. Julian immediately felt the familiar expectation that he should yield to it. Then the mark on his wrist warmed. The pressure vanished. The machine remained active, its lights still glowing, but the sensation of command disappeared completely. Nathan stared at the readings. That should not be possible. Margaret smiled faintly. And yet it happened. Vincent leaned forward. His own alpha presence had sharpened instinctively in response to the device. Julian noticed it, and Stillheart answered. Silver light moved beneath his skin. Vincent's resonance disappeared from the room as a force, but Vincent himself did not change. His expression, thoughts, posture, and decisions remained entirely his own. Julian suddenly understood the distinction. It does not control you, he said. Vincent looked at him. No, it only removes the pressure. Nathan checked the instrument. Exactly. Stillheart does not impose a competing command. It neutralizes coercive resonance. Julian stared at his wrist. All his life, he had been taught that strength meant making others feel your presence. His power seemed to ask the opposite question. Who were people when nobody could force them bend? Margaret unfolded another document. There is something else. Stillheart remained dormant in later descendants because awakening required an act of genuine autonomy. Julian already knew what she was going to say. The divorce. Not divorce specifically, Margaret corrected. Choice. Your mother's letter says the power awakens when the heir freely leaves a bond maintained by fear, obligation, dependence, or unequal authority. Vincent became motionless. Julian looked at him. So leaving you awakened it. Pain crossed Vincent's face, but he did not defend himself. Then I gave you reasons to feel trapped. You never locked a door. I did not have to. Vincent's answer surprised everyone. He continued quietly, my house, my employees, my accounts, my schedule, my decisions. I kept telling myself I was providing everything you needed while building a life where almost everything depended on me. Julian felt old anger rise beside something more complicated. I tried to tell you. I know. No, you know now. Vincent lowered his gaze. You are right. Julian had imagined receiving that admission. Countless times. It did not repair 3 years, but it mattered because Vincent did not attach an excuse to it. Margaret broke the silence by placing another record between them. The document contained 2 symbols, the broken crown and the original Callaway crest. Nathan translated the oldest inscription slowly. The Callaways had once sworn to protect Stillheart heirs, but protection carried one sacred restriction. A guardian could never claim authority over the person he protected. Julian looked at Vincent. Vincent read the next line himself. When protection becomes possession, the guardian has broken the oath. The words settled heavily between them. Then the pendant around Julian's neck opened with a soft click. A hidden compartment appeared inside it, revealing a tiny folded map. Margaret leaned closer. I have never seen that. Julian carefully unfolded it. One location had been marked beneath an abandoned Callaway property outside the city. Beside it were 3 words written in faded silver ink. Vincent recognized them first. The first sanctuary. Julian looked at him. What is there? Vincent shook his head. I do not know. For the first time since their marriage began, Julian believed him completely. The abandoned Callaway property stood nearly 50 miles outside Chicago, surrounded by old oak trees and fields that had long since reclaimed the edges of the road. Julian arrived in his own car shortly after noon. Vincent was already there, but he had kept his promise and brought only Nathan and Margaret. No private convoy waited nearby. No Callaway employees had been sent ahead to search the building. Julian appreciated the restraint because 6 months earlier Vincent would have secured every room before allowing Julian within a mile of the place. You waited, Julian said. Vincent glanced toward the weathered stone house. The map belongs to you. The property belongs to you. Apparently my ancestors disagreed. Margaret examined the map while Nathan compared its markings with an architectural survey. The visible house was not their destination. Measurements indicated an older foundation extending almost 30 feet beyond the eastern wall. Julian noticed a row of decorative stones partially buried beneath fallen leaves. Each carried the same broken crown he had seen on his wrist. They followed the stones to an old garden where a circular foundation surrounded a dry fountain. Julien répondit Ahmed. He approached carefully, but nothing opened and no convenient hidden door appeared. Maybe we are looking at this incorrectly, he said. Nathan studied the map. The drawing shows the sanctuary beneath us. No, Julien replied. It shows the sanctuary beside water. He looked at the dry fountain, then toward the tree line. Was there ever a creek here? Vincent remembered an old property survey mentioning one that had been redirected decades earlier. Nathan found the original route on his tablet. The four of them followed it nearly a quarter mile through the woods until they reached a shallow stone channel covered by moss. At its end stood an unremarkable structure built into the hillside. Margaret smiled. That is why nobody found it. Everyone searched the house. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old paper. There was no treasure chamber, only a circular room containing sealed cabinets, carved inscriptions, and a long table designed for study. Julian ran his fingers near one inscription without touching it. Can anyone translate this? Nathan photographed the symbols and compared them with his notes. It says the first sanctuary was established to preserve freedom from compelled bonds. Vincent's expression changed. Another inscription bore the old Callaway crest. Nathan translated more slowly. Guardians protect choice. They do not replace it. Julian looked toward Vincent. Your family really needed that reminder carved into several walls. Apparently repetition was considered necessary. It still is. Vincent accepted the remark without protest. They spent hours cataloging records before opening anything. Julian insisted every discovery be photographed and independently logged. Near sunset, Margaret found a ledger describing marriages between Stillheart heirs and guardian families. Julian expected to discover that his marriage to Vincent had been arranged generations before either of them existed. Instead, the record said the opposite. No guardian possessed hereditary claim over an heir. Any marriage between the bloodlines remained valid only through continuing consent. So our families did not predetermine us, Julian said. No, not tan replay. Your marriage appears to have been coincidence. Vincent gave a quiet laugh without humor. That may be the first comforting thing I have heard all week. Julian turned another page. Why? Because if I ever become part of your life again, I do not want an ancestor taking credit. Julian's hand stopped. Vincent immediately added, I am not asking. I know. That was precisely why the words affected him. Nathan moved to another cabinet and discovered financial ledgers bearing names Julian recognized from Callaway history. The earliest Callaway network had funded safe housing, legal representation, and relocation for people escaping coercive contracts. Over generations, the network accumulated wealth and influence. Later descendants had transformed protection into control until the original mission became almost unrecognizable. Vincent read in silence. My family built its power protecting people from the exact kind of hierarchy we eventually started benefiting from. Julian watched him carefully. What will you do with that? Vincent closed the ledger. I do not know yet, but pretending I did not read it is no longer an option. Before Julian could answer, his wrist warmed. This time the light did not point toward a door. It illuminated faded writing already visible on the table, words everyone had overlooked because they were nearly the same color as the wood. Nathan leaned closer. The inscription referred to a second archive, called the Covenant Hall, and to relationships deliberately removed from later histories, including partnerships between male alpha guardians whose sacred bonds rejected dominance entirely. Julian felt the mystery widen. Why erase that? Margaret asked. Nathan looked troubled, because it challenged the idea that hierarchy was natural. Beneath the inscription was a final line naming the person authorized to open Covenant Hall. Not the Lost Prince, not a Calloway guardian, a witness. Julian looked around the sanctuary. Who is the witness? Vincent found a smaller symbol beside the word, an open hand beneath 2 stars. His face went still. Julian recognized that expression now. You have seen it before. Vincent nodded. On something my grandfather left me. What? Vincent met Julian's eyes. Our original marriage certificate. Vincent did not return to Chicago that evening. Instead, he asked Julian whether he wanted the marriage certificate brought to the sanctuary, and when Julian said yes, Vincent arranged for a trusted archivist to deliver the sealed family document without opening it. The distinction mattered. Hours later, under the sanctuary lights, Nathan carefully unfolded the certificate while Margaret compared the symbol near Vincent's signature with the inscription they had discovered. The open hand beneath 2 stars matched perfectly. This was added after the legal signatures, Nathan said. Different ink, much older formula. Julian looked at Vincent. Did you know? I knew my grandfather had the certificate placed in the family archive after our wedding. I thought it was another Calloway tradition. Margaret studied a handwritten note attached to the back. It says the witness is not a spouse, title, or blood right. It is a person entrusted to preserve truth when power has an incentive to rewrite it. Vincent frowned. Then why is the symbol beside my name? Nathan searched the older records for nearly an hour before finding an answer. The witness role had sometimes passed through guardian families, but it was never automatic. A candidate had to reject personal advantage when protecting a Stillheart heir's freedom. Julian leaned back. That does not sound like our marriage. Vincent did not defend himself. No, it does not. The honesty landed harder than an excuse would have. Margaret continued reading. The role can remain dormant until the candidate makes a choice that costs him something he wants. Julian understood before Vincent did. The divorce. Vincent looked at him. Nathan nodded slowly. Possibly. You asked Julian to leave, but that alone would not qualify. The records describe surrendering a claim when keeping. It would benefit the guardian. Vincent's expression tightened. I have not surrendered anything noble. I failed my husband. Those are different questions, Julian said quietly. He remembered Vincent refusing to interfere with his investigation, waiting outside the property, asking where Julian felt comfortable meeting, and admitting uncomfortable truths without demanding forgiveness. None erased the past. They did suggest that Vincent was finally learning from it. Nathan found another reference to Covenant Hall. The witness symbol functioned not as a magical key, but as an authorization recorded in a sequence of historical coordinates. By comparing old property surveys, Julian noticed that the coordinates did not describe another Calloway estate. They traced a line through 3 former safe houses established by the original protection network. The locations form a triangle, Julian said. Margaret studied the map. And what is in the center? Vincent calculated the distance. An old civic building on the south side. Nathan searched public records. The structure had once served as a 19th century legal aid office before becoming a historical archive. Julian smiled faintly. A hall preserving equal bonds hidden beneath a place that protected people through law. That is almost too appropriate. The next morning, they received permission from the archive director to examine the building's restricted basement records. Nothing opened because Julian touched it. Nothing glowed because Vincent approached. They found Covenant Hall, because Julian noticed an inconsistency between the original floor plan and a later renovation map. One wall was nearly 4 feet thicker than the structural design required. Behind a removable archival panel was a sealed records room that had been documented under an obsolete classification number. Inside were marriage contracts, partnership declarations, legal arguments, and personal testimonies spanning generations. Nathan read in astonishment. The oldest records challenged nearly every modern assumption about alpha hierarchy. Some documented alpha and omega partnerships based explicitly on equal legal authority. Others described beta mediators holding power over royal disputes. Several preserved accounts of male alpha romance between male alpha guardians whose sacred partnerships rejected dominance as the foundation of intimacy. Julian read one declaration twice. Strength without choice is merely pressure wearing a noble name. Vincent stood beside him. That should have survived. Maybe that is why it did not. They continued until Margaret discovered a ledger explaining how the records disappeared from public history. There had been no single dramatic purge. Terminology changed gradually. Archives were reclassified. Relationships that contradicted the dominant hierarchy were described as ceremonial brotherhoods instead of romantic partnerships. Stillheart became folklore. The Lost Prince became a children's legend. The original Calloway protectors became remembered only for the powerful organization their descendants eventually built. Vincent stared at the pages. My family did not simply forget what it was. Nathan shook his head. Someone benefited from a forgetting. Julian's silver mark warmed, but he did not need it to understand the implication. The mystery was no longer only about his identity. Someone had rewritten the meaning of power itself. Then Margaret found a final sealed index listing the people who had authorized the historical revisions. One surname appeared repeatedly across nearly 2 centuries. Julian recognized it immediately. Vincent did too. It belonged to Bennett, the family of the senior financial advisor who had spent years presenting Julian's ideas as his own. Vincent read the Bennett surname 3 times before closing the ledger. Julian expected anger, commands, or the immediate mobilization of every resource attached to the Calloway organization. Instead, Vincent took out his phone and called his legal director. Suspend Bennett's access to all company records and financial systems, pending an independent audit, he said. Do not accuse him of anything. Preserve every document exactly as it exists. Julian watched him end the call. That was surprisingly restrained. I'm discovering restraint has advantages. You should put that on the family crest. Vincent almost smiled. Nathan reminded them that a surname repeated across generations did not prove the current Bennett knew anything about the historical revisions. Julian agreed. The evidence needed verification, not revenge. By afternoon, an independent forensic accounting team began reviewing the modern records while Nathan and Margaret continued tracing the older documents. The pattern that emerged was subtler than Julian expected. Bennett's ancestors had not created the hierarchy alone. They had served generations of powerful families who benefited from presenting alpha dominance as natural, sacred, and unavoidable. The erased histories of equal bonds threatened that system because they proved society had once organized power differently. Julian looked at one restored declaration between 2 male alpha guardians whose partnership had been recognized nearly 200 years earlier. Neither man had surrendered authority to the other. Their bond had been honored precisely because both retained it. They erased evidence that equality had already worked, Julian said. Because people are harder to convince something is impossible when history proves otherwise, Margaret replied. Vincent remained silent. Julian noticed him reading a separate document, an old Calloway marriage covenant. What did you find? Vincent hesitated before handing it over. The covenant contained an obscure family provision allowing the head of the Calloway line to delay dissolution of a marriage for 90 days when family security or inheritance was disputed. Julian stared at the page. Their divorce had not yet received final court approval. You could use this. Yes. And legally keep the marriage open. Temporarily. Julian looked at him carefully. Do you want to? Vincent's answer came without hesitation. Yes. The honesty surprised Julian more than denial would have. Vincent continued, I want 90 more days. I want another year. I want the chance to repair what I damaged. But wanting something does not make me entitled to it. He took the covenant, walked to Nathan's scanning station, and requested that it be permanently entered into the historical record before, instructing his attorney in writing that he waived any right to invoke it. Julian said nothing. Vincent turned toward him. The divorce proceeds on your timeline. You realize what you just gave up. A mechanism for keeping you married against your preference. Vincent's expression softened. That should never have been mine to use. Warmth spread through Julian's wrist. Silver light appeared beneath his sleeve, brighter than before, but something different happened this time. Vincent's alpha resonance did not disappear. It settled. Julian could still sense its strength, yet there was no pressure behind it. Nathan looked at the monitoring device they had brought from the library. That is different. Julian frowned. Ow! Stillheart neutralized coercive resonance before. This time there was almost nothing to neutralize. Vincent looked at Julian. Meaning? Margaret answered quietly. Perhaps the power is not responding to who you are. Perhaps it is responding to what you choose. Julian felt the implication before he understood it. The ancient guardian oath had never promised compatibility. It had demanded freedom. Vincent had just chosen Julian's freedom, even when doing so threatened the one outcome he desperately wanted. That evening, Julian and Vincent walked outside the archive, while Nathan and Margaret continued cataloging records. Chicago traffic hummed beyond the building, ordinary and indifferent to forgotten princes and sacred bloodlines. I need you to understand something, Julian said. Today does not erase our marriage. I know, and discovering that you can change does not obligate me to come back. I know that too. Julian studied him. Then why are you doing this? Vincent looked toward the street before answering. Because I spent years thinking love meant making sure nothing could reach you. I never asked whether my protection had become another wall around you. His voice remained steady. If becoming better only matters when it wins you back, then it is not becoming better. It is bargaining. Julian had no immediate response. Vincent gave him the silence instead of filling it. Before they returned inside, Nathan called them back. Urgently, he had decoded another witness record. The dormant witness role could awaken only when a guardian voluntarily surrendered a legitimate claim over the lost prince without expecting reward. Vincent stared at the waived covenant on the table. A faint silver symbol appeared beside his recorded signature, an open hand beneath 2 stars. Julian's broken crown answered with gentle light. Nathan read the final line of the ancient text. When crown and witness stand together by choice, the last archive will reveal why Stillheart was erased. Julian looked at Vincent. For the first time, the question was no longer whether history had connected them. It was whether they would choose to uncover the truth together. Julian expected the last archive to require another hidden key, but Nathan's translation pointed them toward something more difficult, a decision. The witness record identified a sealed collection beneath the original Callaway headquarters in downtown Chicago, a building Vincent's family had owned for generations. By morning, Vincent had secured permission from Margaret, Nathan, Julian, and an independent preservation specialist to examine the historical basement. He did not restrict access to Callaway personnel, and Julian noticed that too. The old floor plans showed a narrow records chamber behind the original foundation wall. Rather than relying on Stillheart, Julian compared renovation dates and discovered that one section had been deliberately excluded from every modern survey. Behind a removable panel, they found a steel archival door bearing the broken crown beside the open hand. Vincent looked at Julian. Together, Julian considered him, then nodded. Together, their marked hands touched separate metal plates. Silver light traveled across the door, but instead of opening immediately, words appeared between the symbols. Nathan translated them. No sacred bond exists where choice cannot leave. Julian felt Vincent become still beside him. Then the lock released. Inside were dozens of preserved testimony books documenting the final years before Stillheart disappeared from public history. The truth was less dramatic than a conspiracy led by one villain, and more disturbing because of it. Powerful families, lawmakers, scholars, and social institutions had gradually adopted a system that treated alpha dominance as proof of natural authority. Records contradicting that belief became inconvenient. Equal alpha and omega partnerships were reclassified. Beta mediators disappeared from legal histories. Male alpha romance between guardians was rewritten as ceremonial brotherhood. Stillheart was especially dangerous to the new ideology because its sacred power demonstrated that removing supernatural pressure did not weaken society. It allowed people to reveal what they actually chose. Julian closed one testimony. They were afraid of a power that did not control anyone. Margaret nodded, because it exposed how much other power depended on control. Nathan found a document written by the final publicly recorded Lost Prince. It contained no prophecy and promised no throne. Instead, it warned future heirs never to use Stillheart to create a new hierarchy. The power was sacred precisely because it protected the space in which consent could exist. Julian read the final sentence aloud. Freedom is not sacred because people always choose wisely. It is sacred because the choice must remain theirs. Vincent looked at him. Julian understood why those words mattered between them. Their marriage had not failed because Vincent lacked love. It had failed because love had existed inside a structure where Vincent possessed nearly every practical advantage and rarely questioned what that imbalance cost Julian. Another testimony described the witness. The role was not a destined mate, owner, or protector with authority over the Lost Prince. A witness existed to challenge the crown whenever power began disguising itself as care. Vincent gave a quiet breath. So my sacred ancestral purpose is disagreeing with you. Julian glanced at him. You finally found your calling. Vincent smiled, and for a moment the years between them felt lighter. Then Nathan discovered the most important record. The connection between crown and witness was not romantic by definition. History recorded siblings, friends, political partners, and lovers, serving together. Some have been alpha and omega, others beta. Several were two male alphas whose romances became celebrated examples of equal sacred partnership. Nothing predetermined love. Then whatever exists between us is not because of these marks, Julian said. No, Margaret answered. Vincent's gaze remained on Julian. Good. Julian raised an eyebrow. Good. I've already spent enough of my life letting inherited systems tell me what relationships should look like. Vincent paused. If you ever choose me again, I want that choice to belong entirely to you. Julian's chest tightened, but he did not answer with a promise he was not ready to make. Instead, he reached for Vincent's hand. Vincent looked down at their joined fingers. The silver marks glowed, yet Stillheart remained quiet. There was no overwhelming resonance, no invisible force pushing them together, only warmth and the unmistakable awareness that Julian could release Vincent's hand whenever he wanted. That freedom made holding it meaningful. Later that afternoon, Vincent called a meeting of the Callaway Executive Board. Julian attended only because Vincent invited him as an independent historical stakeholder. Vincent presented the verified records and announced a full restructuring of the organization. Its legitimate businesses would remain, but private practices built on intimidation, coercive contracts, or inherited influence would end. Independent oversight would be established, historical archives would be open to researchers, and the original protection fund would be restored as a legal assistance network. One executive asked whether Vincent understood how much authority he was voluntarily surrendering. Vincent answered without hesitation. Yes. Julian watched him and realized this was the first time Vincent's loss of control looked nothing like chaos. He was deliberately giving control away. When the meeting ended, Vincent found Julian beside the window overlooking Chicago. The divorce becomes final next week, he said quietly. I know. I will not interfere. Julian turned toward him. I know that too. Vincent nodded. accepting the distance Julian still needed. As he started to leave, Julian spoke. Vincent, he stopped. When it is final, ask me to coffee. Vincent looked back, surprise breaking through his composure. Julian almost smiled. Coffee is not reconciliation. Understood. It is not a promise. Understood. And I choose the place. Vincent's smile appeared slowly. That part one expected. Julian watched him leave without trying to turn one small invitation into something larger. His wrist warmed gently beneath his sleeve. For the first time, Julian understood the oldest secret of the Lost Prince. Stillheart had never been created to make powerful men lose control. It existed to teach them when control should willingly be released. 6 months after the divorce became final, Julian Reed returned to the same downtown office where he had once signed away his marriage. But this time there were no attorneys waiting for him and no document deciding what his future should become. Vincent stood near the window holding 2 cups of coffee. You remember my order, Julian said. I remembered it during the marriage too. Remembering was never your problem. Vincent accepted the correction with a small smile. That had become one of the strangest changes between them. He no longer treated criticism as something to defeat. Their first coffee after the divorce had lasted 40 minutes. The second lasted 2 hours. Months followed through dinners, archive meetings, long walks beside Lake Michigan, and conversations they should have had years earlier. Julian never moved back into the Calloway mansion. He built his own life instead. With Margaret and Nathan, he established the Stillheart Sanctuary as an independent historical and research institution dedicated to preserving erased records and studying ethical resonance. Vincent helped fund its restoration, but Julian insisted the Calloways receive no ownership rights. Vincent agreed before Julian finished explaining why. The Calloway organization changed too. Independent oversight replaced private control, coercive contracts disappeared, and the Restore Protection Fund provided legal assistance to people trapped by unequal social systems. Vincent lost influence in some circles and gained enemies in others, but he never used those consequences as proof that Julian owed him forgiveness. That mattered. The ancient archives were eventually opened to scholars, revealing forgotten Alpha and Omega partnerships, beta mediators, sacred guardians, and records of male alpha romance that had survived centuries of deliberate reclassification. The discoveries changed public debate, but Julian refused every attempt to turn the Lost Prince into a new symbol of superiority. If Stillheart becomes another excuse for hierarchy, then we learned nothing, he told the Historical Council. His power had grown stronger, yet its purpose remained beautifully limited. It could silence supernatural coercion. It could not make anyone agree, love, forgive, or stay. Julian considered that limitation the most sacred part of it. Now, inside the quiet office, Vincent placed his coffee on the table. Why did you ask me to meet you here? Julian reached into his coat and removed a single sheet of paper. Vincent looked at it, but did not touch it. What is that? Something I wrote. Am I allowed to read it? Julian smiled. Yes. Vincent picked it up. There are no financial clauses, inheritance provisions, family obligations, or promises of permanent obedience. Only one sentence appeared above 2 empty signature lines. Neither of us belongs to the other. We choose to walk beside each other for as long as that choice remains freely ours. Vincent read it twice. This is not a marriage contract. No. Julian watched him carefully. It is the principle any future marriage between us would have to survive. Vincent slowly lowered the page. Future marriage? Do not become unbearable. Vincent laughed, and Julian realized how rarely he had heard that sound during their first marriage. I'm trying very hard. Try harder. Vincent became serious again. Julian, are you certain? 6 months earlier, Vincent would have interpreted the paper as an answer. Now he asked. That difference was Julian's answer. I am certain that I want to choose you today, Julian said. Tomorrow, I want both of us to choose again. Vincent nodded. Then that is enough. Julian signed first. He handed Vincent the pen, the same black fountain pen he had kept from the day of their divorce. Vincent recognized it immediately. You kept this? It reminded me that leaving was the first decision I made entirely for myself. Vincent looked at the pen, then at Julian. And now? Julian smiled. Now staying is another one. Vincent signed beneath him. Silver light appeared briefly around Julian's broken crown mark, and the open hand beneath 2 stars warmed on Vincent's wrist. Nothing compelled them closer. No ancient prophecy declared them destined. Julian reached across the table because he wanted to. Vincent took his hand because Julian offered it. Outside the windows, Chicago moved beneath a clear autumn sky, indifferent to forgotten princes and restored histories. Julian thought about the frightened man who had once believed being loved meant becoming easy enough not to leave. He no longer recognized him. Vincent had changed too. The Alpha Mafia Boss, who once measured security by how much control he possessed, had learned that love became meaningful only where another person remained free to walk away. Julian looked at their signatures and understood the strange symmetry of his life. The first time he signed beside Vincent, he had ended a marriage to recover himself. The second time, he was not surrendering that freedom. He was bringing it with him. Vincent squeezed his hand gently. Coffee tomorrow? Julian raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me on a date after we just signed that? I am practicing daily consent. Julian laughed. Then yes. Coffee tomorrow. The Stillheart mark remained quiet, and Julian was glad. They needed no sacred power to validate what happened next. History had given them a crown and a witness, but history did not own their future. They did.